And then you just mentioned there's these other parts of the brain and central nervous system where you don't really have so much of a blood-brain barrier, and things can get in. In fact, the hypothalamus can sample the blood because there is kind of a direct connection there at certain points. And so there's some opportunity sometimes for things to get in and out that you might not want to get in. And so we have these resident immune cells, but let's just assume everything's functioning well. It's a healthy individual. You don't have any pathogens from the periphery getting into the brain that aren't supposed to be there. What are these microglia things doing? Are there bugs that are just sort of there in the background, or are they doing other things besides looking for and clearing out pathogens?
Yeah, exactly. So it's largely thought that what they're doing, I mean, so they play key roles in the remodeling of neural circuits. And so it's kind of been classically shown that what they're doing is they can eat or phagocytose exuberant synapses. And when this process is dysregulated, it can lead to different diseases. There's there's this, microglia also play key roles in the metabolic regulation of the brain and sort of what's going on in within circuits. And then, I should add that there's also other types of glial cells that are not immune cells, such as astrocytes, which are sort of CNS resident neuroectodermal lineage cells that are doing similar functions, and these are not immune cells. So they also have the added benefit of sensing the vasculature and also contacting neuronal synapses. And so it's kind of thought that microglia as the resident immune cell and astrocytes as one of the types of glial cells, including like oligodendrocytes and these other types of cells, are involved in just sort of maintaining the environment, actively maintaining the environment of the brain so that neurotransmission can happen properly. So
Hmm.
that's kind of how we broadly view the functions of microglia, perivascular macrophages, and other types of glia.
Mhm. So maybe we can start to think about these cells not purely in terms of they're monitoring the environment external to our cells for pathogens like bacteria, but they're just monitoring the environment generally. And even if there are no pathogens around, they might monitor the metabolites that are leaking out of a synapse and all of that stuff, and just sort of sensing what's going on in order to function in some way to keep things, within homeostatic ranges that we want to keep them at.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And then I think the way we sort of view it in the context of disease is when you start having perhaps impaired barriers or increased signals that are normally not sensed by the brain or not sensed in high quantities. It's when you start to throw off balance this homeostatic regulation of brain circuit communication as well as the glial regulation of those processes. And so that's kind of how we view the whole system working together.
Mhm, mhm. And so, yeah, and so microglia, these resident immune cells of the brain, they are actually involved in things like the structure of synapses. They can participate in that process.
hmm Yeah, exactly. So there's a whole cascade that's been worked out that it's thought that there's a deposition of molecules that actually facilitates microglial pruning of synapses that may not be heavily used, let's say. And so that's kind of how we view like what they're doing natively in the brain, at least during development, and in some cases in the context of disease. And so microglia can also release inflammatory factors that can then within the brain start to signal to things like neurons and astrocytes to also modify their functions, which again you would view as linked with metabolism, neurotransmission, and ultimately behavior when you start modifying the tissue microenvironment.
Mhm, mhm. And so when we start to hear things about like neuroinflammation, inflammation that's happening within the brain and the central nervous system, what does that start to look like? How does inflammation manifest within the brain?
Yeah, so I think the way I interpret neuroinflammation, my background is in multiple sclerosis, which is an autoimmune neurodegenerative disease. And so when I think of neurodegeneration or neuroinflammation, that is a dramatic case where the BBB is dysfunctional. It's very permeable to the extent that infiltrating immune cells can get into the brain and also the spinal cord. And not only that, but those immune cells are actively targeting central nervous system antigens such as myelin or aquaporin 4 or other antigens. And so when I think about neuroinflammation, that's how I think of it, which is immune cells definitively infiltrating the brain, where they're releasing cytokines, they're inducing an actual immune response. So there's an antigen that they detect, and they, to some extent, cause neurodegeneration. I guess that's one extreme end of the spectrum. I think there's a much less dramatic example, right? Which would be you kind of have these leakier barriers where perhaps peripheral products or peripheral cytokines can get in. Perhaps they activate microglia or they activate astrocytes. So these are cytokines that are not present normally in high quantities. And then this starts to transform the brain microenvironment and sort of shifts, I guess you could call it the inflammatory set point of a particular tissue.
Mhm.
So there's kind of this continuum, but in my head, neuroinflammation is, I guess a dramatic example where immune cells are getting in, they're releasing tons of cytokines, and I think there's a more of a homeostatic regulation where, there's also low levels of cytokines that can influence circuit function.
Hmm.
Yeah, in a more of a modulatory way.
Yeah, yeah.